Thank you to our speakers. We proceed now to the next session, which is a conversation titled To Carry, Reflections, and it's a pleasure to welcome Sharjah Biennial 16 co-curators, Alia Swastika, Amal Khalaf, Megan Tamati, and Natasha Ginwala, and Zeynep Öz. This session will be recorded as an episode of Biennial Bites, the official podcast of Sharjah Biennial 16. The second season of Biennial Bites launched this weekend. Tune in to hear artists and curators share insights, anecdotes, stories, and special renditions of songs. New episodes drop every Monday. You can listen through Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Rami, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou, again, mihi atu kia koutou. I'm kicking off the curatorial reflection, and I wasn't quite sure what I should talk about, because I feel like I've just talked and talked. I was going to talk about some key ideas within my project, and I will do that very quickly, but I think we're also just going to ask one another some questions rather than do a presentation. So all I was going to say is Ihi is a project which sits between the physical and the spiritual. It occupies an in-between space, the tangible and intangible, and is about potential and the realisation of potential. I suppose, I've loved working with these women, and I really liked that the decision was made that we'd kind of do our own projects and kind of stay true to ourselves. That to me was very important, but of course there were synergies between us all as well. I felt like the way in which we operated was really, there was a respect and a reciprocity between us. Zeynep, I wanted to talk about your project and the decision to, you had a whole narrative that went on and the cohesion of the work at Alded. Can you talk a little bit about your project and what that meant or means?
Thank you. All right, this is great. I think after all this time, it's like we have been talking a lot about them, but thanks for that question. Maybe, we're doing it a different way now. So that's not what I'm going to talk to. I will ask Megan about that next. But first off, if I talk about Alded, I think
there's something like 35 artists there, is that right?
Yeah, there's like a lot of artists there, 35 of them. I think one of the things I knew first when I was starting out is I really like to work in a way that is very, I love growing in a place. I like making homes, I think. And I love taking over a building. I said this to her one time, thanks for giving this opportunity to actually take a larger place and sort of grow in it. I do a lot of site responsiveness, and Alded is a place where, for those of you who were there, it's an oasis town. It's a place where there is water, which means there was a lot of experimental agricultural back in the day. My larger prompt that I started out with was moments of accelerated technological change, to look at it in a very historical way. And when I sort of started working in Alded, I started thinking that it would be a place where I would look at what land is and what the water technologies, irrigation technologies, and archaeology of the space is. I think it just shaped what I ended up looking and working with. And I started moving things around according to that. One thing you and I have talked about before, and I will toss this question back to you in that way, is being site responsive. And I think that's something you do a lot individually. And for me, it was something that being in Alded and having that walkway through and thinking about the clinic, what that meant, the oasis town where it is, and having the palace where there was a narrative of founding, but how technologies play within nation building and narrative building was very important for me, and a lot of the works that are commissioned responded to that, but then also it shaped what I also chose to present in a lot of ways. And with that, I'm gonna toss it back to you with the site responsiveness.
And then I'm going to toss it to Natasha. No, in terms of site responsive, I did that a little bit. I think that the work, I mean, there needed to be, whenever you're curating a project, the work has to have a resonance, I think, with the space in which you, whether you commission it or make it or put it. I mean, I did a number of site visits with artists. So there were places like LD1, of course, where I wanted to have people like Luke's work, which was about constitutional change, because it was the ruler's court. You know, I put those works of Fiona's, which were chiefs and rangatira, or like very high, important people in that location. I couldn't see them in any other location. Calibre, again, for me, out there, a lot of the works are about environmental collapse, or there's a reference to like earth and water. But Natasha, I wanted to pass it to you because I know that you used Beit El Sakal in a certain, was it, or Shamsi in a certain way? Sakal, sorry.
So
one of them.
If it's okay, I'd like to actually elaborate on the process and the nature of how my project has evolved. And to start with the reference that I guess some of you may have read, for me, was really to think about a historic architecture that is very close to my home in Gujarat, in Ahmedabad, which is a 5-story stepwell in Adalaj that was built by a queen in the 15th century. And this stepwell is a motif that I have been returning to, also in the spirit of collectivity, in the spirit of deep listening, of connecting to building resonance, also of micro-histories, of times of tumultuous change and transition as we are carrying in this particular moment as well. And to really think about orature from this space of the well. Of course, the water well is also a reference within the architectures in Sharjah, the household well in Beit al Sarkal, in Beit Habib Yusuf. There are artists like Risham Sayed and Rajni Pereira who very specifically responded to the well, but also the shared curatorial propositions in the biennial. And that kind of site responsiveness was something that I was very inclined towards and perhaps couldn't enact in other biennial making processes. So it's been deeply satisfying to be able to operate in a site-specific mode in this kind of very attentive way to the local architecture, but also think about site and region, as we've talked, especially with Amal and Alia, about the maritime and the relation to the Indian Ocean, the kind of Afro-Asian continuum that is also so vital to the way that Sharjah Art Foundation and the Sharjah Biennial has chronicled a critical, expansive regionality. I also feel that one of the, I was thinking about our curatorial process, and I was thinking about it as clairvoyant curating in some sense, because often we were working across time zones and our regional travels that were often taking us further apart, just physically, and we couldn't always do site trips each time coinciding with one another, because we were obviously also spending a lot of time with the artists. And so, yet there was this kind of commitment to a solo navigation that was in response to the artistic process and methods, but also this clairvoyant iterative way in which there was a relay of ideas and echoes and commitments. And just, sorry, but I've kind of like, I just want to make a full circle before sharing, before kind of prompts across us. But one such was, for me, really Zeynep's invitation to contribute to the Yaz series, and I'm just so deeply grateful for that, because I would have shied away from something of this nature, and I think this act of writing as a speculative, poetic form of curatorial research was just something I've never allowed myself to do, and so I'm very grateful for allowing for this vulnerability. And there was a short text before this that, you know, was just such a prompt, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just this aspect of imagining protagonists of history as well, like the water carrier, you know, the forgotten protagonists of our times. Also, you know, the sonic, as we've spoken, and I think that would be my prompt, really is how the sonic is not only a mode, it's also a series of scores. It creates a kind of performative grammar for this biennial at a velocity that biennials don't often do. And so even as we work with the archival mode, the kind of archival impulse, the sonic allows for the counterpoint. It allows for the slippages of what art history cannot, and that art history refuses to add to the archive. And I think projects like the Singing Wells or the work of the dancer choreographer Chandralekha, and the generational response relay back by the poet Tishani Doshi, who performed a new work in you know, channeling her mentor Chandralekha on the opening week. I think these for me are just modes of adding to that archive, adding to the imprint of these practices, often feminist, often matrilineal, and often collective. So I guess just for now, perhaps to mention that, and also maybe bring in Amal, because one of the other things we did was to create vinyl records as part of the biennial, and so even the act of publishing while making the biennial and not separating the act of publishing from exhibition practice was something very ingrained and genuinely explored. So the ancestral well, Pulse to Terrain, also exists as a record that will come out in March, that I worked on with a composer and percussionist Sarathi Korwar, and there are artists like Nicholas Jar, Naima Neferteri, who's Moki Cherry's granddaughter, Asha Gambedze, several other artists who've been part of this vinyl record that also is a form of commissioning that has been deeply gratifying. And with that, I'd love to invite Amal to also share these resonances that we've had across each other.
Thank you. And thanks, I think we're like working into this rhythm of a conversation, and thanks for prompting with the sonic, and I think quite a few of us can maybe respond to that as well. And it's something that I was reflecting on as we're all returning here. So the last time we were here, last time we were walking around the biennial and giving tours, we were straight off some mad adrenaline rush of hoping that the works would be up in time and like in this space of building. And so being able to walk around now, to be here with you all, another audience, some of you the similar audience from the opening, something I have been noticing in my body as I'm walking around is this ability to listen fully with my whole body to all of the rhythms and the different synchronicities. And I was talking to each of you as we were doing our different tours at different times. I was like, oh, right, this echo just feels much stronger. This resonance is here. This dissonance is even deeper now. And just to say, listening as a practice has always been an approach that I would describe my curatorial practices as. And the sonic was also, and sound and knowledge that comes from voice and collective voice was a starting point for the project, for me, an entry point to thinking of what a biennial can be at this moment of, in this moment in the world. And we've spoken about this so much, about what it means to make a biennial at a time of so much violence, genocide, and grief. And so this idea of the lament and the mourner and the matrilineal history, my grandmother being a lamenter, I was really thinking about this idea of sonic spaces, collective voices, polyphonic sound, as being a holding space to process the world, not just to process violence and grief and loss, but also to process possible calling in of new futures. And I feel there was many different ways that sound was also a prompt, because that story of my grandmother was a prompt that I gave each of the artists that were invited into the process. For me, this process has been a complete conversation with each and every artist and project that has been part of Throwing Shells. I think each of them shaped the project just as much as any prompt or framework I could ever give was. And, you know, song was often offered back. And I think the idea of the sonic, as a form, maybe one thing I'll say about it is it became a great carrier for these gestures of embodied shift or invitations to shift that the many different projects that have been part of this biennial have given. And so I feel like, yeah, there's something about drums, breath coming into rhythm together, feeling different tempos. The project with Benatas, doing a record with them, is a kind of a different type of publishing project. I think I was really interested in this idea of collective, like even in this space of the school, we have Voices in Unison at the back with Suzanne Lacey's project that she did in the mill, with Sufi voices, different voices telling stories, different ways song, and these kind of carriers, vessels of different types of knowledge will appear. But I think what was most interesting for me is this idea of how the sonic can be a space of gathering. And maybe that would be my prompt to some of you or all of you. I just wanted to think of, oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, just to say, I'm very interested as a curator in being able to support a process for people to do something with others. I was very struck by, and I learned so much from each of you on the way that you have done that through your projects and through some of the artists that you've been working with that I didn't know their practices, how they also do that. And I can speak a bit more to the different projects I've invited, but I wanted to speak about process and gathering and how maybe this has emerged in your different curatorial processes, this prompt for collective thinking, collective learning, and doing. And maybe Alia, maybe I'd first ask you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us like in the middle of, like, it's quite hot in the last weekend and like long day all the time with the tours. So thank you for being with us. And as I mentioned by Amal, it's kind of like quite bizarre feeling also now being here and reflecting all the process that we already go through for 18 months preparing the biennials. But yeah, very, very happy also to be able to somehow bringing this reflection not only to myself, but also like listening to each other. So when Amal mentioning how like the process-based curatorial approach in a way becoming one of the highlight or being underlined in the process of realizing this biennial. I really feel since the beginning that is my first or the core of my way of working. So I've been working with lots of community in Indonesia in the last 10 years, and at the same time also thinking how to build the dialogue between what happened in Indonesia or in Southeast Asia with the context of UAE or in the Arab region. So in the beginning also, I was thinking how the process, not only thinking about the production or exhibition making or creating the artworks, but really much opening the platform for the artists and the collaborators to encounters like new narrative, new way of working. So many of my projects really based on this idea of like traveling together or doing research together or collaborating within like transnational context, transgenerational, but also translocalities. So yeah, like I work, so in the beginning, like I was very inspired by the method that develops by the Wo Manifesto, where during, I think during the mid of 1990s, they already invite like older generation of female Asian artists and beyond, some Australian, some European, to do this project of traveling together where each of the cities or the town where they visited, they work and collaborate with local communities. I think it's a very beautiful project to expand the meaning of art making and to connect with the community around that period of time in Southeast Asia. So I was wondering how you somehow trying to reenact this project with very different conversations of the notion of contemporary art today, but at the same time also like looking into different methods of presenting or creating the platform of exhibition. So it's not only, as I mentioned before, creating the artworks, but really bringing the stories. It's a process of storytelling that is becoming more important than the artwork itself. And so I did like, do you want, can we see some projects? Where is it? Okay. So this is like the mending project by Wo Manifesto, where they invited everyone, like the audience, to be part of the ongoing projects of mending. And during the opening, for me, it's also very delightful how the audience very enthusiastic to be part of like this mending project, like the local community, the mothers, mingle with the audience from very diverse background. Next one. Next again. Yeah. So it's kind of like in the back, so the weaving project. So one of the research and residencies, for example, bringing 3 different artists from different countries. Next, yeah. Where we went together to 6 cities in the Flores Islands in Indonesia, and we collaborate with the mothers and really learning what is the meaning of weaving, not only as a process of making like the fabric, but it's really the whole lexicon and grammar of cosmological knowledge for the mothers itself. So we stay in the villages and we see being part of their everyday practice, and each of the artists, they translate and creating the artworks in a very different perspective, but at the same time, very much based on their relationship with the mother. And now I see how the process is really continuing, like Yensam until now still coming there and still continue the collaboration with the mothers, and then also Gunes thinking to bring these two artists and the weaver from Flores to come to Istanbul. So, you know, there is this kind of like ongoing relationship that coming from this process. So I think for me, the most memorable impression and reflection is really much about how you bring the stories to go beyond the exhibition space, to live in like the everyday life of the people that being part of our stories. So maybe Megan, you can, because now I'm talking about, yeah. Many of my stories, for example, really much focusing on the stories of like maternal knowledge or women connection and sisterhood. Okay. Do you think this perspective also shaping your curatorial approach?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a lot of very senior women in my project. People like Faye Heavyshield, people like Fiona Partington, who hold people like Mabel Julie, Emily Ngawari, you know, like people who hold space and hold knowledge. And for me, I think culturally, it's usually the women, where I come from anyway, that hold those knowledges and pass them through. In Māori society, the men do the talking. However, it's the women that hold the genealogies and all the histories, and usually the very senior women. And so for me, that's really important. I spent, like you, Amal, I spent a lot of time with my great-grandmother, who probably gave me everything that I could have from a cultural perspective. And that had a real imprint on the way in which I operated. So even people like Yvonne Kumatri, there's a lot of, for me, it was important. Kaeli Chan, Kapulani Landgraft, but then I also put people like Saffron in there, who's younger, but works with cosmology and again holds space in a different way. Yeah, women's are important to me, and the knowledges and the ways in which they operate. Women artists, which is quite different sometimes to male artists. I don't know if I can say much more. I was going to say before too, we talked about, you know, even Inaha, and you were talking about the sonic. For me, it was more song, and song again, because it comes from a cultural position. And the idea, like when we did the whakawatia, like the blessing that took 15 hours across the whole emirate. I mean, that wasn't performative. It was actually deeply held kind of ceremony that was on, you know, like, but that's all to do with song and activating space through song. Marati K's work at the Flying Saucer, for me, had to have sound in that space to kind of make it kind of operate and function. The song that he made, Michael's piano, you know, he talked about, you know, music or song filling a space like no object ever could. So I use song in that way, and the woman's voice is always the first voice, so I'll just finish on that.
Yeah, no, I was just reflecting on what you just said about song and how it was used, and I think that was, there's always, because I worked on so many new commissions, it was just like an like a learning process. Like it was like an invitation, this commission, let's learn something, let's make something together. And I think song and voice and listening became a method for that. Helena Kazan is an example, for example, using voice or singing Layali L'Uns for Vienna, or learning Esmahan's last song as a way to think about justice and how to revisit violent colonial histories that she's interested in through learning a song, or thinking about collective voice. For example, I invited Voice of Domestic Workers who use song a lot in their gatherings. So Voice of Domestic Workers are not an art, they do not claim to be artists. They're a political organization that have been working in the UK for over 10 years now to fight for domestic worker rights in the UK, and they work a lot with artists. So I invited them to actually curate a collection of ways that they have worked with artists to talk about what art can be as a vehicle for social organizing, art as a channel for other forms of being affected in the world. But I think song and voice becomes used in a very directly political way for them. Yeah.
I just wanted to maybe continue from something Alia was saying to indicate a little bit for the audience as well the two I think entwined aspects. One is, what does it entail in a biennial like Sharjah to undertake research travels and research experiences? I wanted to just address that in a way because, you know, being on the biennial making circuit, I mean, obviously movement is a privilege, and yet there are certain ways in which curators, biennial curators, do operate in terms of entering contexts that are not their own and work in a certain way towards inclusion or exclusion or a politics of representation of art making, right? I mean, these are the basics. But what I felt particularly strongly about in relationship to how we worked was that there wasn't this immediacy around research as something that has to be done in this 1 or 2 year period where we need to push ourselves into certain contexts or attend certain other biennials to make quick selections. I just wanted to kind of reflect on that because I think that is a way of practicing curatorial ethics as well. I just wanted to give 2 examples and also pass it back to Alia, because I really appreciate the way that you've worked in Jogja as well in that sense, where there are these enduring partnerships and ways of working with cultural practitioners that include poets, pedagogues, activists, and so forth. And in terms of this idea of research-oriented mode, it felt for me like an artist such as Jorge Gonzalez Santos, whose work you may have seen in Moreja, who's from Puerto Rico and is looking at Taino indigenous practices of making. This was an artist I met in 2016 in Puerto Rico during a residency. And while we did not work together since that very important occasion to meet and to observe his process, I kind of was in tune with how he was working collectively and the way he was in exchange with his elders. And there was an immediate knowing that when this invitation to Sharjah happened, that there would be this occasion for him to welcome him here. And he worked for 1 month in the site where his work is present. And so I really feel that we cannot, there are so many urgencies amidst us that we cannot give in to this kind of false pretext of biennial urgency as sometimes very, very quick and rash decisions of inclusion and exclusion. And of course, there is a certain, impulse between us to think about a global majority, to think about indigenous participation and celebrate those knowledges. And there have been comments on, oh, there's not much whiteness in this biennial, and was that deliberate? You know, was it an exclusion that was deliberate? And I really love that the ethic of representation here runs so deep, and it runs through the other kind of organizing structures like what you've been doing in Jogja as well, and what I've been trying to do in Colomboscope, and these other models that we support and sustain through our work as well.
Yeah, I think to somehow imagine one project and then you realize you came to like completely new areas or like a place that is more unknown for your practice. It takes some time for me also to understand how things work here. For example, with the project of Pracaya Pintong, like this is maybe one of the earliest project I start from the beginning. I think we started working February last year, and we did lots of research meeting of many marine biologists, scientists, like people working under the water, like people from the heritage area or the architect background. And then there are times that we felt like, oh, maybe this wouldn't work, or that the research that we did maybe doesn't really apply to the context of this landscape or seascape, because we are working under the water. So there are many obstacles in a way that we felt like the result of our research maybe wouldn't apply it here. But then we give time. I think that's also the most important thing that I learned from the whole process, that you cannot really force the time, you cannot really force how the process could become. So like there are moments like 3-4 months we just wait, nothing happened. For me, there's also another pressure, because what will I show in the exhibition? But then it becomes, you know, like when you wait and then suddenly something, so he always say there is a moment of luck also that you need to bring during the process. But then for me, it's not really about luck in the sense of something coming out of the sky, coming to you, but it's more like the patience, like listening to different contexts and learning how to play within like different board games. So I think that's really important during the whole process. Then the whole process somehow like complete with like 1 month before the opening. And then even the video we are editing like 2 days before opening. But that's kind of like, you know, like this learning to understand like various obstacles and listening to different people with the different contexts as you imagine. I think that's really one of the things that I learned from the process. But now when Natasha mentioning about urgencies, I'm thinking also lots of the project that we present here somehow dealing with activism or you know, like how we bring these political voices, stories, narrative, and I'm interested with the previous conversations with Zeynep and the planners. I think it's very interesting to dig into these more questions of the ethics of working with community, working with local context, where after this biennial, we are all going back to our context and what is happening with the projects we built here. So maybe Zeynep also can reflect more on your own conversations with the planners. How do you see these questions of temporal activism, but at the same time, how can this spirit to be continued?
In a way, I don't know if I have any activism. No, of course, I'm saying that in a way that is like, I think something I think a lot about, for me, like a lot of these projects are coming from a very like personal place, and it's coming from conversations I've had with a lot of the artists that are in the projects, artists, writers, thinkers, different people for over a long period of time. I am thinking of someone like Fatma Balkis, who's in the courtyard in Gallery 1 with the parquets that are coming off, the flooring piece that like is about the house being flooded and being displaced, and also her publication that is the one that she edited that is about shedding, which is about losing relationships, people being shed away, friendships, relationships being shed away. that is very close to Olivia's work, of course, and Celia's work. And right across there in the other gallery is Day to Day, which is sort of about the everyday. One of the works there is literally about how do you wake up every single morning and continue your day and the politics of that. And there's also work that is about the transformation as a woman that you go through. I don't know that there is necessarily political, there are different ways of being political. I think a lot of the ways in which these works came about and the way that I navigated actually bringing in the people that are showing, that are commissioning, and the way that I had conversations with each of you when Natasha said the booklet, or when I have had so many conversations with you about displacement, about mobility, homemaking, and all of these things. I think those conversations seep in various ways that are not necessarily acts of politics making, not real politics making, but I think they come from very deeply held concerns that are values, that are things that people have been grappling with for a period of time, that they're trying to come to terms with. It is very much about certain political attitudes that are reflected in the moment in how they're reacting to things and what they're saying, but they're not necessarily, they don't necessarily have the language of everyday politics. And I say that not to talk about a way of working, which I think for me, I think about this a lot, like how I try to navigate a moment, and this is, I navigate a moment by reading history. I'm a nerd in that way. I look at history things, I try to understand what people have thought about and looked at. That's sort of the premise of like how I started out doing this thing. But I don't necessarily try to understand it by like necessarily talking about this moment necessarily directly, because I think it's too soon, it's hard to talk about it, and it's very, you're fragile and you're vulnerable, and I think in that moment to talk about it in certain ways is too close. But I think there's a way to talk about it that is taking into account languages that have come before you, and to sort of think about that a little bit. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but that's sort of how I will leave it, and then maybe I'll pass it on to you, because you can maybe talk to that.
I suppose for me too, I like to work in the abstract, and I think we've all worked poetically as well as kind of directly or literally. I mean, there's people like Richard Bell's work, which is very direct, but then there's others that the politic that sits behind it is definitely there, but it's covert as opposed to overt. I suppose even my approach to including majority of First Nations artists, not exclusively so, but because of that's what I also know and have grown up within, both as a curator but as a human. And when you talk about urgency, the urgency around some of those things, but I also didn't want to get kind of stuck in this kind of, I suppose, a trauma or a, I always want a way through and a way out, and I feel like artists often offer those kinds of solutions, or yeah, I mean, I think I'm like you, Zeynep, I'm interested, of course it's political, even everything that you do is political, I think. Yeah, but I'm not sure what I'm saying, but you know what I think you do know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I was just going to say in response to the discussion we're having and your prompt about what it means, what is the trace. I think there's something there about methodology. I think also something I was learning from, and the way that, you know, some of the prompts you had initially, Zeynep, were thinking about contracts, social contracts, economies, like moments of transition and technologies. And I think I've been thinking about, like, with groups like Biennale, or the process I did with Maya Telet Hawad, for example, is I think with biennials, there's a real politics in a way of working with artists, in a way of commissioning, in a way of supporting an openness about economies. I think what we should talk about when we're saying global majority in the places we're working in and from is that not all of the artists are working in contexts where the economy is comparable to here or to London, where I've been working a lot, for example. And yeah, I just think that there has been really interesting prompts by some of the projects, some of the artists. I was really interested in working with collectives because of how I was interested in bringing into this biennial examples of ways of working collectively, and also directly talking about debt, economy, and like sharing. So the record, for example, with Biennale, for those who don't know this network of incredible people, they curated an exhibition. Adam Haji Yahya curated an exhibition explaining what Biennale is, but they also produced a record, and they're rethinking together as a collective of artists, designers, and musicians how to share resources directly. It's about money and how the art world operates and values certain Palestinian artists and not others. And so then how do we redistribute money? For example, with Maya Telet Hawad, we worked with 48 women from Tuareg Confederation. Maya is a researcher who's now at Yale and lived in Paris. Like, we were talking about how do we name in a biennial context 48 people. I wasn't allowed to put 48 people on a label for an artist. You know, it was really interesting to like come up with that. For me, that's also political processes of talking about how we work together, how we function in a time of overwhelming multiple crises, and then how do we address this openly and talk about it as part of the process. And yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to add on to that because I think that was also where I was hoping this could go in a way, because the biennial as this short-term circuit of art making and exhibition production is clearly not, I mean, in one sense, it's not also in the DNA of the Sharjah Art Foundation, which works so often with artists over longer periods of time. And there's this sense of hospitality that you are welcome here and your work is part of the trajectory of this space that moves in circular time. And I think in many ways, us as cultural organizers and not only institutional curators in a certain part of the world, in a certain economy or geography, I think really, at least we try to stay true to that, but also to think about resource sharing, to think about mutual aid, to kind of not just work with artist collectives in a very formal sense, but for me to work with, again, a pedagogic practice like Sakia has just been such an immense learning experience to think, to understand land heritage in the Palestinian context, but then also see what it means for such a practice to coalesce in Sharjah, and invite that practice from a very different orientation, knowing what is going on, to understand how these resources can be channeled differently. I was really moved by Alia's project with the non-aligned newsreels. Now, spending time with it today and realizing how incredible that invitation has been to invite colleagues and students from the Africa Institute and the emerging global university to facilitate that kind of exchange with such a valuable archive. But again, the non-aligned movement can be so formalized and feel so far away from us. And how to bring in that kind of urgency, which again is creating new reciprocities. So there are countless examples once we start going in that direction, but it really does feel that certain seeds have been planted, and that invitation is there to others who visit the biennial as well to facilitate these, new means of thinking about the biennial as a multi-faceted space of learning and resource exchange.
Alia, do you want to talk a little bit about the archiving, like how you work with that? Your process has been a lot about what Natasha just said about the bringing forth. Actually, I'll just toss it over to both of you. Like you have, or all of us, what's the sort of like space of archives and what you presented and how you decided to present that? I'll just start that. Pose that as a question. Whoever wants to take it up, can take it up. And why you chose the archives that you wanted to present here and how you did that. I think text plays an important part in different ways in all of our works, like what we chose to deal with it, and it's in different ways, so maybe whoever wants to pick it up can pick it up. And
yeah, one project that I work with and presented here in the Casimia School, the concrete thread repertoire, is actually one of project that opening that question, because what is the meaning of collecting these stories and gathering all this archive, but then you show this in very far from their context. So since the beginning, I have that question. So this demand to build the conversations with the local audience is also important. So I started, in the beginning when I started this project, I already asked them what they want to do with their own stories. I think it's important to underline that this is the story about their community. So they're the owner, they're the author of the stories itself. So the way I work with their archive is somehow facilitating all the communities, the mothers, the people who are involved in that movements, lots of civic movements there, and trying to bring them voice in different way in the language that they want to be presented. So we publish a book also, many of the text in the book is really coming from themselves. So they wrote letters from the children, the younger generation, to the mothers who were the fighters, or we did also a script, workshop for script for the young people who wants to learn how to make documentary about their own movements, and we put the script as the text in the book. So it's really we don't try to frame their archive, we don't try to frame their movement in our way of thinking, but just really giving and facilitating them to speak on their own. So I think that's one of the most important, how they create their own language, using their own language, and this is just the vessel to present their stories. And the second one, we asked them what they want to do after this. So one of the project in that, one of the resistance in that room is about Kendeng, all the mothers who fight against the cement factory. It happened 9 years ago, and this movement became very famous in Indonesia. All the younger generation very inspired by this movement. But then every time the researcher or journalists or artists, activists came to their village, they don't really have the trace of their movement. So we discussed with them, and they told me they wanted to create this museum for their movement in their own village. So now we are in the process of making it happen, the small museum that can be also is the place for the younger generation to learn about the struggle of the previous generation. So I think the way we work with the idea of archive is not really just presenting as exhibition, but really how you keep the stories alive, and it can be even developed further by the younger generation in that community?
Yes, just briefly thinking in parallel in a sense, because there's the notion of the archive, which is again it's a contested idea in itself of what the definition of archives as used within biennials is and can be. But I've been thinking a lot about the notion of repositories, especially for this biennial, in terms of how artists build repositories of situated knowledge and of collective experience, and how that is in fact what is under threat of erasure in many other moments, not only now. And so one example is in fact You'll Know When You Get There with Rajeshri Goody, who I should mention because when I think about water resources and infrastructures, the way in which Rajeshri particularly builds this incision into and thinks about insurrection through the archive as a Dalit person looking at resistance and things like the Mahad Satyagraha and ways to retrieve the memory of portraits of those who have visited this water body from which Dalits were not permitted to access, and this particular journey that then henceforth changed that entire equation so drastically. I think these kinds of turns and these approaches, I think, are also very present, and they, again, I guess, are a way of dreaming about, what futurities we want to get to in terms of building room for dissent, but also, again, thinking with the deep past, thinking with the ancestral. So, circling back, I guess, for us, I think that kind of repository is in many ways anachronistic to the notion of a static archive.
I'm not sure that I worked with the archive at all. The closest is probably Albert Lefferty's work, which really is a number of, I think there's 264 drawings that mark a moment in time, that mark ceremony, that are based on a Samoan spatial relationship over time, and of actual events. But in terms of the archive, I didn't actually work with the archive. I feel like his is the closest, but it's not an archive in a Western sense. It's an archive of memory, an archive of knowledge, an archive of relational connection. I don't know if you understand what I mean, but so that's probably for me. As I said, I didn't work necessarily with an archive in a very literal or Western kind of way. House of Wisdom, really Michael's work is always about knowledge and is always about time. For me, a lot of the work that I've done in this project is really a negotiation of time, but not in a linear kind of sense. The elephants, as I said, are a critique of Western knowledge systems and their bookends. It was the perfect location for that work to go into. It asks existential questions about what knowledge is and isn't and who owns knowledge. But I really, as I said, it kind of interrogates that as opposed to, as I said, working with a particular archive. If you know what I'm saying, I don't know.
We are running out of time, and I guess we could go on, but we have shared a lot, and it's late. But I really feel also, just to say that, in a sense, the way the biennial is also being activated, and even the ways that we are telling each other's stories and resituating ourselves within the biennial as we continue to visit it, and as you all come through, it does feel that it is still in emergence, because a lot of especially the performances and the recitals and the poetry is a form of this continuously building on what the exhibition is. So just to kind of again welcome you to think with what you've also seen in these past few days with us. And for those who are based here, really, I think April also is this time where we're going to have a lot of workshops, a lot of gatherings, again, thinking with the sonic, thinking with embodied practice, so a lot more performance, moving across the venues, and keeping the biennial a shifting ground to the extent that we can. So thank you so much for keeping space in your brains and in your bodies to hold this, to be with us.
Thank you.